But I think the point of it is that so often in life we do things for a gain, which is another thing this book is. It is pretty funny, and there were moments where I actually laughed out loud. I like the variety of ideas women in books have in order to reinvent their perspectives. So, All Fours by Miranda July is about a middle-aged woman who is married, and she decides to drive from California, where she lives, to New York for a week. And the whole trip is going to take her 3 weeks. But on the way, when she's not very far into the journey, she stops off at a small town and decides to check into a motel. She realises that she has free will and can actually go anywhere and do anything. And as a consequence of this feeling, she decides to start redesigning the hotel room. Meanwhile, she also becomes quite interested in a man who works at a Hertz garage. The novel is about free will and rebirth at middle age and romantic relationships. And I think it represents what a lot of my favourite literature is about, trying to survive in a world that doesn't really make sense. And I wanted to make a whole video dedicated to this book because it really got me thinking, and I think it's fantastic. And it's also a book that came out in 2024. So let's talk about it. Also, I was so enjoying reading this book that the other day I had to go to Berlin Central Station, and the train that I was waiting for was delayed, and so I just wandered around the station for a bit, and I found a Hertz rent-a-car shop. And because one of the characters, or one of the prominent characters in this book, works at a Hertz garage, it felt like seeing a celebrity in real life. That's how deep into the story I was. So, picture this. You are driving from California to New York. You stop at a random town, check into a motel, and you think, maybe I will completely abandon my original plan and just redesign this motel room. And this act was such a representation of exerting your free will, because there's no reason to redesign a motel room. You don't own the motel room, so eventually you're just going to have to check out, and any money that you put towards redesigning the room is really going to be a bit of a waste of money because you don't own the property. But I think the point of it is that so often in life we do things for a gain. We work to get money, or we work to get prestige, and it's not often that we do things just for the fun of it, especially if it's detrimental to our bank accounts and doesn't really have anything to show for it at the end. But what then happens as the novel progresses is this motel room comes to represent something quite wonderful. It becomes a safe haven for the protagonist and represents a place in the world where she can just be herself. She's not a mother or a wife or an artist. She's just this person in this motel room. And I liked how the motel room continued to be present throughout the story, even though about 25% in the story moves away from the motel room plotline and becomes something different all the time. It's a very ever-changing novel, an unpredictable novel, another reason why I liked it. So a lot of the novel centres around the character of Davy, who works at the Hertz garage, and the protagonist develops quite a severe obsession with this character. And this obsession isn't entirely because of Davy, it's also suggests other things about the protagonist, for example her own mental state, because becoming obsessed with someone who works at a Hertz garage doesn't really suggest that you are functioning at a completely normal state and level. And I quite liked how the novel didn't shy away from having the protagonist be obsessed over someone else, because that act is not one that would be viewed as that advantageous by a lot of people, since as women, I suppose, we are supposed to be more than just our romantic relationships, which is right, because for so long throughout the past, women were very much defined by their partners and their husbands. So it's right that in the modern age we shouldn't define ourselves so much by romantic relationships. But I think it's true that love is a large part of our lives, and really I think for most human beings what we do is usually because we want to be seen, we want to be loved. And so her obsession was understandable, because she's feeling lost and untethered, and she finds this person who makes her feel more grounded and more connected, and of course you're going to become obsessed with that because of what they represent. And I suppose you may think that if this character is obsessed with a man called Davy and she is married, that doesn't mean that she's particularly admirable, and you would be correct in that assumption. I think you're not meant to agree with everything the protagonist does. I think it's quite easy to understand where she's coming from, but she's not always that likeable, and I love that in characters. I think in being unlikable, actually someone becomes almost more likable, you know? If someone is just like almost perfect, you think, well, that's not realistic. We're all flawed human beings. And I think the protagonist in this novel was so well crafted. She felt so real. And it's not just the Davy relationship that the novel looks at, it also looks at other romantic relationships and how that is a fluid thing, not really a stagnant thing. Relationships are always changing, and I liked how the novel explored that. So I've read a lot of coming of age stories, and I think now that I'm nearly 27, I'm becoming a little less enthralled by them because I feel quite detached from my life as a teenager because it's getting further and further away. But I think that there are so many times in our lives when we come of age again. I don't think it just happens when we're teenagers. I think that's a really significant time because there are a lot of changes with our body and our lives and our relationships. But I think we are continually coming of age in a way, and at different parts in our life we are changing. And I think this novel was like a coming of age story, but for a person in their 40s, 50s, someone in middle age, which felt so refreshing because I can't say I've read a book like that before. Perhaps I've encountered some media which looks at this topic, but I think maybe there's a tendency for it to be a bit maybe sentimental, and I liked how this book wasn't sentimental. It was cringy at some points and crude and erratic and not like wrapped up in a bow. It really showed the reality of things. And I wrote some notes while I was reading, and I said the whole novel is about the protagonist being reborn in a way similar to that of My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottesha Moshfegh. In this novel, the protagonist sleeps for a year in order to be reborn at the end of the year. And here the protagonist remodels a motel room, and I like the variety of ideas women in books have in order to reinvent their perspectives. So, is it a modern classic? And I think there are a lot of things that contribute to a novel being defined as a classic. I think one of those things is that these novels often represent the time in which they were written. For example, Pride and Prejudice represents what social and gender relations were like during the 1800s in England. And something like The Great Gatsby represents the flaws in the American dream in the 1920s. And this book, I suppose, All Fours, shows the landscape of life in 2024. It shows how the way we interpret relationships is changing. It shows how women and their struggles and their bodies are becoming more known about, because I think the menopause is really something that is not talked about, and I very rarely see it in literature from the past especially. So I think the fact that it exists here, a big discussion about the menopause, is really significant. And I think for me, if I revisited this book like in 5 years time, in 10 years time, in 20 years time, I would still get a lot from it. I think it speaks to what it is to be a person living on this earth and trying to feel comfortable in your body and in the space which you exist in. And a lot of books are about that topic, but I think this book explored it in a way which just really spoke to me. And I will also add a note at the end of this video, and that is that if someone read this book and they didn't like it, I could actually understand that. There are some books that I love, and if someone read them and said they didn't like it, I would maybe struggle to understand that opinion because I love it so much. But I think it's a bit different with this one. And I think that's because I can understand why some people might not want to read about a character that is struggling so much with their identity and who reveals so much about their personal life. Because I suppose although there is the hook of this character deciding to redesign a motel room, that isn't really the plot of the novel. The plot of the novel is, can this person come out the other side of this internal crisis that they're having? And maybe that's not your cup of tea, or maybe it is. And if it is, I definitely recommend reading this book. I loved it very much, and it's one of my favourites of the year so far. So thank you very much for watching. Have you read this book? Let me know what you thought of it, and I will see you in another video soon. Bye bye.